Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
He walked in like he owned the place, which technically I guess he kind of did, given the board handed him the keys just 3 days earlier and he wasted no time, acting like the second coming of Steve Jobs, only with worse shoes and a smug little smirk that told you he already had a hit list in his back pocket. His name was Gavin Pierce, and from the moment he entered that glass-walled conference room with his chest puffed out and handshake ready, I knew, just knew, something ugly was coming. What I didn't expect was for it to come so damn fast. He reached out, shook my hand like we were old college buddies at a reunion, leaned in close enough for his expensive cologne to hit like a punch in the face, and said the words I'll probably remember longer than my own wedding vows. "You're too close to the old regime, Matt. I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." No warning, no performance review, no dignity. Just a handshake and a sentence designed to cut deep and clean, like a scalpel in the hands of someone who thinks he's a surgeon but has never held a blade. For a second, I thought he was joking. Some twisted New Age team-building prank to establish dominance, maybe. But then I looked in his eyes, and there was no irony there, just polished certainty, like a man who reads books with titles like How to Fire with Confidence and genuinely believes he's smarter than everyone else in the room. I nodded, because what else was I supposed to do? Punch him? Cry? Beg? Nah. I've been in the corporate world long enough to know that the real knives aren't the ones you see coming, and this kid thought he was some kind of silent assassin, slicing heads while quoting metrics. So I smiled, not because I was happy, but because there was nothing left to say, and because I knew something he didn't. I knew exactly how many moving pieces were glued together with nothing but the decades of loyalty, knowledge, and quiet management I'd poured into this company. I knew what happened when you pulled the wrong brick from the bottom of the tower. He gestured toward the HR rep who had apparently been sitting silently in the corner the entire time, like a plant in a suit, and she slid a folder across the polished walnut table like we were signing divorce papers. Severance package. NDA. A polite letter of thanks filled with enough vague pleasantries to make it seem like I'd left voluntarily. 22 years, reduced to 5 sheets of corporate issue nothingness. "You'll have until Friday to clear your desk," he added, and I could see it in his face. He expected me to argue, to push back, to fight for my spot like a desperate man clinging to the last rung on the ladder. But I didn't. I shook his hand again, this time holding his gaze just a beat longer than necessary, and said with absolute calm, "Good luck, Gavin. You're gonna need it." The moment I stepped out of that conference room, it was like being underwater. Muffled voices, slow movements, the surreal sensation that somehow this couldn't be real. 22 years of birthdays remembered, crises averted, systems improved, clients saved from walking out the door. All of it meant nothing to this fresh-faced MBA, who probably thought Excel macros were cutting-edge innovation and that Slack emojis counted as leadership. As I walked back to my former office, I passed a few familiar faces, and the way they looked at me said it all. Pity, shock, a little fear. In this kind of environment, when the walls start talking, nobody feels safe. Packing up took less than an hour. I've always been efficient, even when I'm bleeding. A few photos of my kids, a commemorative plaque from a record-breaking logistics deal back in 2013, a mug that said Chaos Coordinator, which felt painfully ironic now, and a USB drive I kept for personal projects. I didn't speak to anyone on the way out, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't trust myself not to say something I'd regret. I've learned over the years that silence can be louder than any speech. Driving home, I kept rehearsing it in my head, the way he said it, the smug tone, the perfect lack of empathy. "You're too close to the old regime." As if loyalty had become a liability, as if stability and memory were now threats to the brave new future this guy was engineering with buzzwords and cost-cutting initiatives. I wasn't even angry, not yet anyway. I was just numb, like someone had hit the off switch but forgot to tell the rest of the system to shut down. That night, I had a quiet dinner with my wife, kissed my kids goodnight, and stared at the ceiling until 3 a.m., wondering if maybe I really was just a relic, a well-spoken dinosaur politely shown the door. But something inside me, something old and patient, told me to wait, to watch, because I had a feeling Gavin Pierce wasn't half as clever as he thought he was. And this company? This company wasn't built on swagger and spreadsheets. It was built on quiet people who knew where everything lived, and what would happen if the wrong hands started flipping switches they didn't understand. What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back like this? Would you fight? Would you walk away? Or would you, like me, wait, knowing some battles are won by doing absolutely nothing at all? There's a certain silence that follows a professional execution, not the literal kind, obviously, but the slow, surgical removal of a person from a system they helped build, nurtured, protected, and quietly kept from collapsing more times than they could count. The first morning after being fired, I woke up at 6:45 out of sheer habit, sat at the kitchen table with my usual cup of strong black coffee, and stared blankly at the headlines on my tablet, pretending I had somewhere to be, even though the calendar was blessedly and damningly empty. My wife, Jenna, who has always been far too wise to say something before the wound settles, simply placed her hand on mine and offered a quiet smile that said everything without making me say anything in return. For the first 2 days, I tried to convince myself that maybe this was a blessing in disguise, that maybe I had been too close to the flame for too long, slowly burning up without realizing it, surviving on caffeine and crisis management while climbing a ladder that someone else was now gleefully cutting down. But by day 3, the ache had started to crawl under my skin, not because I missed the meetings or the memos or even the god-awful team-building Zoom calls, but because I knew, in my bones, that the moment Gavin Pierce booted me out of that building, he had unknowingly triggered a cascade of problems he wasn't equipped to solve. And the worst part, he didn't even know it yet. You see, I wasn't just another mid-level guy keeping his head down and coasting on inertia. I was the bridge between 3 departments that never trusted each other, the interpreter between the tech team's jargon and the executive board's inflated expectations, and the unofficial keeper of all the undocumented processes that had kept that company running when other firms our size were going under. I had been the one who soothed angry clients when the logistics software glitched mid-quarter, the one who personally restructured a failing supply chain by staying in the office for 42 straight hours and eating nothing but vending machine granola bars while negotiating with vendors in 5 different time zones. And none of that, not one line of it, was in a manual or a database or a neatly organized SharePoint file Gavin could comb through during his onboarding. But I didn't call. I didn't offer to help. I didn't even open the company's Slack archive, despite knowing exactly where the skeletons were buried, digital and otherwise. Instead, I let the silence linger, let the systems run cold, let the unanswered questions pile up on the desks of people who thought they could reinvent a machine without understanding the gears. And then, late one night, as I sat in the garage sorting through some old tools I never had time to organize, my phone lit up with a message from an old colleague, Janine from Client Accounts, someone I'd mentored years ago when she was barely surviving her first quarter and crying in the break room between client calls. It was short, but sharp. Hey, not sure if you've heard, but things are getting weird. Gavin just reassigned your entire workflow to 2 interns, and the system's been down twice this week. Clients are already talking. Just wanted to say, it's not the same here without you. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew that once you light the match, you don't stop the fire by stepping into it. You watch from a distance, eyes open, breath steady, and let the people who thought they were invincible learn the hard way that arrogance is no substitute for institutional memory. Over the next few days, more messages trickled in, not panicked, not desperate, but inquisitive, tentative, laced with that particular flavor of anxiety you only get when the guy who always had the answers is no longer around to ask. Tom from IT mentioned a server migration gone wrong. Ellie from Legal said she wasn't sure which NDA template to use for the new contracts Gavin was fast-tracking. Someone even sent me a screenshot of a team-wide email from Gavin himself, asking if anyone had insight into the Reynolds Matrix, which, ironically, was a nickname the team had given my custom-built vendor performance dashboard, a tool I created over 6 weekends with no overtime, just because I hated seeing our metrics crumble during Q4. And still, I said nothing. I didn't gloat. I didn't interfere. I didn't even smile. Well, maybe once when I read the words Reynolds Matrix and remembered that I never bothered to explain to anyone how to reset the autofilter that prevented quarterly reports from double counting overseas shipments. You could call it sabotage if you were being unkind, but in truth, it wasn't sabotage. It was absence. The absence of something that looked invisible until it was gone. The thread that held together 1,000 tiny knots, each one tied during a moment no one else had noticed. I hadn't hidden anything. I just hadn't been asked. And Gavin, with all his confidence and his freshly pressed shirts and his vision for the future, never thought to ask. Because men like him don't believe people like me are essential. They believe we're replaceable, swappable, interchangeable gears in a machine they think they invented. So I let the machine run. Without oil, without calibration, without me. And I waited. Not for revenge, not yet, but for gravity to do what it always does to towers built on ego instead of understanding. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't to strike. It's to step back, let go of the wheel, and let the man who fired you steer straight into the wall he never even saw coming. Listen, it started with a hiccup, the kind of small, almost imperceptible glitch that, in a stable organization, would have been patched within the hour and forgotten by lunch. But in the hands of someone like Gavin, who mistook delegation for leadership and bravado for competence, that hiccup was the first gust of wind against a house of cards already trembling under its own weight. On Monday morning, I got a message from an old warehouse supervisor named Gary, a blunt, no-nonsense guy I'd worked with during the height of the 2020 supply chain fiasco, when container ships were stalled offshore and everyone thought the world might actually stop spinning. His message was one line long: "Whatever you did, it's starting." At first, I wasn't even sure what he meant. I hadn't done anything, hadn't touched a system, hadn't whispered a single word to anyone except my wife and the dog. But curiosity, that relentless little itch, pulled me into checking the news alerts, the industry forums, the shareholder chatter, and buried in the back page of a logistics insider blog, I found a brief mention of unexpected delays reported across 4 regional distribution hubs owned by Archon X. That was us, or rather them now, and the word unexpected was a dangerous one, because it meant no one had planned for it, no one had answers, and worst of all, no one was owning the failure. By Tuesday, the hiccup had evolved into a cough. Client orders were missing delivery windows, email threads were being forwarded to directors who didn't understand what they were reading, and Gavin, in his infinite wisdom, had apparently pushed through a restructured workflow that rerouted order approvals through a new automation system, which, shockingly, wasn't ready for real-world volume. From what I could gather, his plan was to centralize all logistical decision-making through a dashboard he barely understood, fronted by a project manager who had only been with the company for 3 weeks and had previously worked in retail analytics, which, let me tell you, does not prepare you for the bloodbath of real-time industrial logistics. I started getting texts, a lot of them. Some from confused junior managers who had only ever known me as the guy who smiled and stayed late. Others from directors who once called my insistence on redundancy paranoid and now found themselves completely exposed. One message in particular stood out. It was from an anonymous burner email sent through Proton Mail, and all it said was, "Gavin is in over his head. If you care about the people left behind, say something." I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because it wasn't about caring or not caring. It was about choosing when to act and when to allow the natural consequences of arrogance to bloom into chaos. By Wednesday, it wasn't just delays, it was cancellations. One of our largest medical supply clients, the kind that signs 5-year contracts and expects surgical precision in return, publicly announced that they were reviewing vendor partnerships due to recent inconsistencies. The phrasing was polite, but the implications were catastrophic. Internally, I knew exactly what must have happened. The tracking numbers were out of sync with the internal inventory system, a problem I'd warned about 2 years ago when Gavin's predecessor wanted to cut costs by ditching our redundancy protocols. I'd built a workaround, of course, but it required human input. Someone who knew when to override the system and when to trust it. That someone, as of last week, had been escorted out of the building with a box full of thankless loyalty and a severance check. And Gavin? Oh, Gavin was unraveling. I heard through Janine that he had started snapping at people in meetings, blaming legacy systems and unmotivated staff, even though the people he'd kept were the ones who'd smiled at his pep talks and nodded at his hollow vision statements. She told me he'd called an emergency meeting with the board on Thursday, trying to spin the narrative as an inherited instability, conveniently ignoring the fact that the instability had been dormant until he started pulling wires he didn't understand. The final nail, at least for that week, came Friday morning when I got a call, not a text, not an email, but a call from Phil Tran, one of the senior analysts from compliance, who I hadn't spoken to in months. He sounded shaken, and not much ever rattled Phil, a guy whose idea of a bad day was discovering an extra semicolon in a contract clause. "Matt," he said, skipping past the pleasantries, "do you remember that internal auditing script you built back in 19 for the procurement oversight?" Of course I remembered. It was a simple watchdog I'd designed to flag sudden shifts in contract terms, mostly to catch lazy vendor reps trying to slide in fees or backdate clauses. Nothing malicious, just smart corporate hygiene. "Well," Phil continued, "it triggered, on Gavin's authorization codes, 3 times, yesterday." I didn't laugh, though I wanted to. I didn't cheer, though I felt the tingle of justice brushing against the edge of restraint. I simply asked, "Have you told the board?" There was a pause. "Not yet," Phil replied, his voice uncertain. "But we will." And just like that, I realized something vital. I hadn't needed to lift a finger. My revenge, if you could even call it that, wasn't forged in fire or fury or sabotage. It was built into the bones of a system I'd spent years shaping. Not for war, not for payback, but for function, for truth, for stability. And now that system was speaking in the only language Gavin would ever understand: numbers, patterns, errors. He thought he was playing chess. He thought he was the king. But the board was mine, and the pieces were already moving. There are certain things in life that no MBA, no leadership seminar, no padded executive onboarding can truly prepare you for. Things like the quiet revenge of a forgotten system, the way code can lie dormant for years until, like an old landmine beneath the sand, someone careless steps exactly where they shouldn't, believing the terrain is safe simply because they don't understand what was buried there long before they arrived. By the time Gavin Pierce's 3rd flagged contract modification landed on the internal compliance radar, the watchdog system I had written in a caffeine-fueled haze back in late 2019, mostly out of personal obsession with operational integrity and a nagging distrust of shortcut culture, was no longer just a passive line of legacy code. It had become, unintentionally, the very ghost that would haunt him. To be clear, I hadn't designed it to be malicious. The script was meant to protect the company, not sabotage it. A simple Python-based trigger that scanned procurement entries for inconsistencies in language, percentage deviations beyond acceptable thresholds, and timestamp mismatches indicative of retroactive edits. It ran every Friday night, quietly exporting flagged entries to a non-editable archive stored on an internal compliance drive that only 3 people had access to: myself, Phil Tran, and Marcy, the firm's longest-serving paralegal, who incidentally trusted code more than she trusted people. I'd even named the tool Watchdog 3.2, not because there had ever been a 1.0 or 2.0, but because the versioning made it sound more official in documentation. And frankly, the higher-ups were always more impressed by numbers than function. Apparently, Gavin hadn't read far enough into the documentation, or perhaps he thought protocols from the old regime were beneath his notice, which would explain why he authorized an expedited contract realignment for 3 vendors in less than 24 hours. With all adjustments favoring new third-party consulting firms he'd quietly introduced just weeks after my departure. Firms, I later learned, with whom he shared more than just a passing acquaintance, some with overlapping board members from a tech startup Gavin had failed upward from prior to this role. Whether it was hubris, desperation, or pure idiocy, I couldn't say. But what I knew for certain was that the system didn't care. Watchdog flagged the anomalies, timestamped them, compared them against historical vendor behavior, and automatically pinged the audit compliance team with a high-severity status report that included my original notes on conflict of interest red flags. Phil called again, this time not to warn me, but to vent, the way someone vents when they realize they've been complicit in something simply by not paying attention. He used his own credentials, Phil said, almost disbelieving. Didn't even bother routing the changes through legal. Just marked them as emergency restructuring measures and assumed no one would look twice. I let the silence stretch. I knew Phil well enough to know he wasn't looking for advice. He was looking for absolution. You don't need me to tell you what that means, I said eventually, my voice calm, almost detached. You've got the data. The script did its job. Yes, Phil muttered, almost to himself. Yes, it did. I spent the rest of that afternoon not gloating, not pacing, but simply sitting at the park with a paperback I hadn't touched in months, letting the spring wind roll through the trees as somewhere, in a building I once called home, meetings were being scheduled that had nothing to do with vision or performance metrics and everything to do with containment, with liability, with legal options, in the event that the board decided they'd made a grave and possibly actionable error in judgment by hiring a man who, only 2 weeks into his tenure, had already crossed ethical lines most executives wouldn't dare flirt with in their first year. What made it beautiful, if one can call such a thing beautiful, was the inevitability of it. Gavin hadn't been undone by an enemy or a saboteur or even a deliberate act of resistance. He'd been undone by documentation, by transparency, by the simple, stubborn persistence of a system that didn't need revenge, didn't need justice, didn't even need acknowledgement. It just needed to run, and when it did, it told the truth, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet, irrefutable clarity. Janine messaged again that night. He's losing it, she wrote, snapped at 2 directors, canceled his Friday call with investors, told the IT team they were sabotaging him. Half the office thinks he's having a breakdown. I didn't ask her for more. I didn't need to. Because once paranoia takes root in a man who thinks the world owes him trust, every shadow starts to look like a threat. Every silence becomes an accusation, and every mistake feels like a conspiracy. And Gavin, for all his charm and polish and buzzword fluency, had never understood that authority is not power. Not really. Authority is a loan, paid back in results and humility, and when that balance is broken, systems, especially the ones designed by people who care more about resilience than recognition, tend to act on their own. Friday morning, I received a formal email. Not from Gavin, of course, but from HR. They wanted to discuss an opportunity to consult on a temporary basis to assist with recent operational realignments. I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because even if they had offered me triple my salary, a corner office, and a public apology, the answer would have been the same. Some fires are best left to burn, especially when the man who lit the match insists he still smells smoke from someone else's torch. And me? I was just a ghost in the machine. One Gavin never thought to look for, and now couldn't seem to stop running into. The thing they don't tell you about poetic justice is that when it finally arrives, not with trumpets or headlines, not with screaming crowds or shattered glass, but in quiet emails, silent conference room resignations, and the heavy footsteps of a man walking out of a building he thought he owned, it doesn't feel like vengeance. Not really. It feels like silence reclaiming its space after months of noise, like gravity finally asserting itself after a season of unchecked flight. And in Gavin Pierce's case, it felt like inevitability disguised as surprise. I found out from a former teammate, Mark, from operations, who sent me a one-line text while I was sitting in a breakfast diner, halfway through an overcooked omelet I didn't have the heart to complain about. "He's gone. 1 week after you." It took a moment to register, not because I didn't believe it, but because I'd already predicted it, not with glee, not with malice, but with the kind of certainty you develop after decades of watching unqualified men climb too high on ladders they didn't build, only to discover too late that no one had taught them how to balance. I read the text again, smiled quietly to myself, and let the rest of the omelet go cold while I sipped my coffee, like a man who had nothing left to prove. Apparently it had all come to a head the previous afternoon. A closed-door emergency board session had been scheduled under the guise of a strategic adjustment review, but everyone knew what it really was: a firing squad dressed up in quarterly language. By the time the meeting ended, Gavin's name had been scrubbed from the internal directories, his access revoked, and his final exit completed in the most humiliating way possible for someone like him. Silently, without acknowledgement, with no farewell email or LinkedIn announcement, just a muted exit under the weight of his own decisions. He hadn't even gotten a chance to spin the narrative, because the system, the very one he thought he'd conquered, had done that for him. From what I gathered, the board had reviewed the contract manipulations uncovered by the Watchdog Protocol, evaluated the internal complaints from senior staff, compared the mounting losses from mishandled accounts, and determined, with all the cold precision of corporate survivalism, that Gavin Pierce was not only a liability, but a PR disaster waiting to happen. The same board that had once praised his fresh vision and disruptive energy now quietly passed the blame along like a hot potato no one wanted to admit they'd ever held. And in a twist that would have made me laugh if I'd still had skin in the game, they offered me a short-term consulting role to help stabilize legacy infrastructure, which was their way of saying, come fix the mess, but don't ask for permanence. I didn't take it, not out of pride or resentment, though both had their place, but because I had already found something far more valuable than a return ticket to the same war zone I'd barely escaped: peace. In the weeks following my dismissal, I had spent time with my family in ways I hadn't in years. Not just being home, but actually being present, not distracted by late-night emails or mentally drafting project plans while pretending to listen to my daughter describe her art project. I had gone hiking again, read real books, taken up woodworking like my grandfather used to, and even helped my neighbor install shelving in his garage, something I never would have had time for when every hour felt like a countdown to the next disaster I was expected to silently prevent. One afternoon I walked into a small coffee shop a few blocks from home, the kind of place with cracked leather chairs and baristas who know your name after 2 visits, and spotted 2 familiar faces near the back window: Janine from client accounts and Raj from systems. They smiled when they saw me, that strange mix of relief and apology in their expressions, the way people look at someone who escaped the flood while they're still drying off. "We're leaving too," Janine said quietly, as if secrecy still mattered. "Starting something new? We were hoping you might, you know." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat down, sipped my drink, and looked out the window at the afternoon sun cutting through the trees, thinking not about revenge or vindication, but about what it meant to build something from scratch. Not just a career or a system, but a life, a meaningful one, driven not by deadlines or titles, but by clarity, by knowing exactly who you are when the floor falls out from under you and you realize that maybe, just maybe, It was never your floor to begin with. I did eventually help Janine and Raj, not as a boss, not as a manager, but as a mentor, a builder, someone who knew where the cracks usually formed and how to build with stronger mortar. We started small, informal, quiet. No slogans, no press releases. Just work worth doing, with people who didn't need to be told twice what loyalty looked like. As for Gavin, last I heard he was exploring new opportunities, which in executive speak usually means waiting for the scandal to cool down long enough to get another job at another firm where no one reads too far into past mistakes. I wish him luck. Not because I forgive him, not because I believe he learned anything, but because some lessons take longer to arrive than others. And who knows, maybe one day he'll find himself in a boardroom with another quietly competent man who knows more than he says, and maybe, just maybe, he'll recognize the trap before it springs again. But me, I never had to lift a finger. Not one. Because sometimes the most satisfying kind of justice is the one that unfolds on its own, slow, steady, and unmistakably earned, while you sit on the sidelines with your coffee in hand, the morning sun on your face, and the quiet certainty that dignity, once lost, is never quite retrievable, especially by those who never valued it to begin with.